In the early years of the Cold War, American officials feared something more dangerous than Soviet bombers. They feared Soviet ideas. Washington understood that nuclear weapons could destroy cities in minutes. But communist ideology, they believed, could slowly erode nations from within without firing a single shot. Governments could fall, alliances could weaken, entire societies could begin questioning the principles that held them together. And in the middle of that fear, the United States transformed a simple patriotic pledge into something much larger, a weapon in the ideological war against communism. Every morning across America, millions of school children stood beside their desks, faced a flag, placed their hands over their hearts, and repeated words that would soon carry enormous Cold War significance. One nation under God. Those two words would become one of the most controversial and politically powerful additions in modern American history, because during the Cold War, even a schoolroom pledge became part of the global struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. To understand how that happened, you have to understand the atmosphere of America in the years after World War II. The victory over Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had established the United States as one of the most powerful nations on Earth. American factories dominated global production. The U.S. Navy controlled the oceans. The country possessed unmatched economic strength. But almost immediately after the war ended, a new confrontation emerged. The Soviet Union rapidly expanded its influence across Eastern Europe. Communist governments took power behind what Winston Churchill famously called the Iron Curtain. Berlin became divided. Intelligence agencies on both sides began secret operations. And by 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. For Americans, the shock was enormous. Until then, nuclear superiority had belonged exclusively to the United States. Now, the possibility of atomic war became terrifyingly real. The Cold War quickly evolved beyond military competition. It became a conflict of systems. Capitalism versus communism. Democracy versus authoritarian control. Religious freedom versus state atheism. American officials increasingly described the Soviet Union not merely as a rival nation, but as an ideological threat capable of spreading across the world. That distinction mattered, because if communism was only a military problem, the solution could be armies and weapons. But if communism was ideological, then America needed something else. Unity, identity, shared belief. The Soviet Union officially promoted atheism as state policy. Religious institutions were heavily restricted. Churches were monitored. Religious influence in public life was suppressed in favor of loyalty to the communist state. American leaders recognized the propaganda opportunity immediately. If the Soviet system rejected religion, then public expressions of faith could become symbols of American freedom itself. This idea spread rapidly through politics, media, schools, and religious organizations during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Church attendance surged across the United States. Religious broadcasts expanded on radio and television. Political speeches increasingly referenced faith, morality, and national purpose. The language of patriotism and religion slowly became intertwined. And nowhere would that become more visible than in the Pledge of Allegiance. Ironically, the original pledge had not been created as an anti-communist statement at all. It was first written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy as part of a campaign promoting national unity during a period of rapid immigration and industrial expansion. The original version contained no reference to God. For decades, millions of Americans recited it in schools without controversy. But by the early Cold War years, the political atmosphere had changed dramatically. Fear shaped daily life. Newspapers constantly warned about Soviet espionage. Government investigations searched for communist infiltration. Television programs discussed nuclear attack scenarios. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills in classrooms. Families built fallout shelters in suburban backyards. The possibility of global destruction no longer seemed theoretical. Under those conditions, symbolism became extremely important. American leaders believed the country needed visible reminders of what separated the United States from the Soviet Union, and the pledge offered a perfect opportunity. Organizations across the country began pushing for the addition of religious language to the text. Religious groups argued that the pledge should reflect the spiritual foundations of a nation. Politicians increasingly framed the Cold War as a moral struggle between freedom and atheistic communism. The campaign gained momentum quickly. One of the most influential supporters was the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic fraternal organization that actively promoted the inclusion of the words "under God." Their argument was simple but politically powerful. The United States needed to distinguish itself clearly from the Soviet Union. The phrase would publicly reinforce the idea that American rights and freedoms came from something greater than government authority. That concept became central to Cold War thinking. The Soviet model concentrated enormous power in the state. American leaders wanted to project the opposite image, that individual liberty existed beyond government control. That freedom was tied to moral principles rather than political ideology alone. Religious language helped reinforce that message. By the early 1950s, the movement gained support inside Congress. Lawmakers increasingly argued that adding "under God" would strengthen national unity during a dangerous period of international tension. Many believed the psychological battle against communism was just as important as military preparedness, because the Cold War was not only being fought with bombers, missiles, and submarines, it was being fought with symbols, ideas, identity, and language. Then came one of the most important moments in the campaign. In February 1954, President Dwight D. Eisenhower attended a sermon delivered by Reverend George Doherty at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. Doherty directly addressed the pledge during the sermon. He argued that without a reference to God, the pledge could just as easily describe any nation, including the Soviet Union. That argument deeply resonated with Eisenhower. The president already understood the ideological dimensions of the Cold War exceptionally well. Unlike many military leaders focused only on weapons and troop numbers, Eisenhower recognized that morale, belief, and national identity were strategic assets. Soon after the sermon, momentum accelerated inside Washington. Congress began moving legislation forward. Public support grew rapidly, and in schools across America, millions of children continued reciting a pledge that was about to change forever, because the United States was preparing to send a message not only to its own citizens, but to the entire world. A message that America viewed itself as fundamentally different from the Soviet Union, different politically, different morally, different spiritually. And if you're interested in Cold War stories like this, where even ordinary classroom rituals became part of global ideological war, consider subscribing, because the decision that followed would permanently reshape American public life and transform one of the nation's simplest patriotic traditions into a powerful Cold War symbol. In June 1954, at the height of Cold War tension, the United States officially changed the Pledge of Allegiance. Congress approved the addition of 2 words, "under God." President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the legislation into law. From that moment forward, millions of American children will begin each school day repeating a phrase designed not only to express patriotism, but to define the United States in direct contrast to the Soviet Union. The change was brief in wording, but enormous in meaning, because during the Cold War, every symbol carried strategic importance, and Washington understood exactly what those words represented. The Soviet Union promoted loyalty to the communist state above everything else. Religion was viewed by Soviet leadership as a threat to ideological control. Churches were monitored. Religious institutions faced restrictions. Public atheism became part of the Soviet political identity. American leaders seized upon that contrast relentlessly. Political speeches increasingly described the Cold War as more than a military confrontation. It was portrayed as a struggle between freedom and oppression, faith and atheism, individual dignity and centralized control. The addition of "under God" transformed the pledge into a daily reaffirmation of those distinctions, especially for children. That mattered enormously. Cold War policymakers believed future generations would determine whether the United States remained strong enough to resist communist influence. Education became one of the central battlegrounds of the era. Schools taught not only mathematics and history, but civic identity. Students practiced air raid drills. They studied the dangers of communism. They learned patriotic rituals designed to reinforce national unity during an age of nuclear fear. Every morning, millions of voices repeated the same words together. The routine became almost ceremonial. Flags hanging beside chalkboards, hands over hearts. Rows of students standing in silence before speaking in unison. For many Americans, the ritual created reassurance during a period filled with uncertainty, because outside those classrooms, the Cold War was intensifying rapidly. The Korean War had demonstrated how quickly local conflicts could become superpower confrontations. Nuclear arsenals were expanding. American bombers remained on constant alert. Strategic planners developed terrifying scenarios involving atomic exchanges capable of killing millions within hours. Then came the hydrogen bomb, far more destructive than the weapons used during World War II. Both the United States and the Soviet Union raced to develop increasingly powerful nuclear arsenals. The possibility of total annihilation became part of everyday life. Under those conditions, symbolic unity mattered deeply. American officials believed national morale itself was a strategic asset. If citizens lost confidence, fear could weaken the country internally. And the Soviet Union constantly attempted to exploit social tensions through propaganda campaigns around the world. The United States responded by emphasizing cohesion, patriotism, and shared values. The pledge became one of the clearest expressions of that strategy. Yet the campaign extended far beyond schools. Television programs reinforced patriotic themes. Hollywood films often portrayed communist regimes as oppressive and dehumanizing. Religious leaders spoke openly about the moral dimensions of the Cold War. Political candidates referenced faith constantly during speeches. The phrase, "under God," fit naturally into that atmosphere. It reflected the broader message America wanted to project internationally, that the United States was not simply stronger militarily, but morally distinct. This image became especially important in developing nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Both Washington and Moscow competed aggressively for influence in those regions. The Cold War was global. Every alliance mattered. Every perception mattered. American leaders believed religious freedom gave the United States an advantage in that ideological competition. The Soviet Union could project military power, but America, they argued, represented liberty itself. And symbols like the pledge reinforced that image constantly. Meanwhile, public support for the change remained extremely high. Most Americans viewed the addition positively. Many families already connected patriotism with religious faith. Church attendance during the 1950s reached historic levels. New suburban churches appeared rapidly across the country. Religious broadcasts expanded nationwide. For millions of citizens, the phrase felt completely natural. But not everyone agreed. Even at the time, some critics warned that mixing government rituals with religious language raised constitutional concerns. The First Amendment prohibited the establishment of religion by the state. Opponents argued that patriotic loyalty should not depend upon religious expression. Those debates remained relatively limited during the early Cold War years. However, fear of communism overshadowed almost everything else politically. Questioning patriotic symbolism during that era often carried risks, especially during the height of anti-communist investigations. The atmosphere inside America became increasingly tense. Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to national prominence by claiming communist infiltration existed inside government institutions, universities, and the entertainment industry. Careers were destroyed by accusations alone. Suspicion spread throughout American society. Loyalty became an obsession. Under those conditions, patriotic rituals gained even greater emotional power. The pledge was no longer just tradition. It became proof of belonging, a visible expression of national unity during one of the most anxious periods in modern American history. At the same time, American military power continued expanding dramatically. Strategic Air Command maintained fleets of nuclear bombers ready for immediate deployment. Aircraft carriers projected American influence across the globe. Submarines carrying nuclear missiles silently patrolled beneath the oceans. New radar systems scanned the skies for possible Soviet attacks. The United States was building a massive deterrence system designed to prevent global war. But military strength alone could not sustain the Cold War effort. American leaders understood something critical. Nations survived long confrontations through confidence as much as capability. The Soviet Union had tanks, missiles, and armies. The United States intended to demonstrate something broader: economic strength, technological innovation, political freedom, religious liberty, and national unity. The pledge became part of that larger narrative. Two added words helped transform a patriotic tradition into an ideological declaration, repeated daily across the country. A reminder that the Cold War was not only a battle for territory, but for identity itself. And as tensions between Washington and Moscow continued escalating through the late 1950s, those symbols would become even more important, because soon the world would enter some of the most dangerous years of the entire Cold War. By the early 1960s, the Cold War had reached a level of tension unlike anything the modern world had ever experienced. American radar systems scanned constantly for incoming bombers. Nuclear submarines disappeared silently beneath the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Missile crews waited underground beside launch controls, capable of ending civilization within minutes. Both superpowers possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other many times over. And in the middle of that terrifying reality, ordinary American school children still began their mornings the same way, standing beside their desks, facing the flag, repeating the Pledge of Allegiance, including the words added only a few years earlier: "Under God." The phrase had become fully integrated into American public life. What once had been a political decision was now a national ritual. Most children no longer knew the pledge had ever existed without those words. That was part of its power. Cold War symbolism worked best when it became normal, invisible, embedded into everyday life so deeply that people stopped questioning it. And while children recited the pledge in classrooms, the global ideological struggle intensified across nearly every continent. The Berlin crisis pushed American and Soviet tanks into direct confrontation near Checkpoint Charlie. Spy aircraft photographed military installations deep inside enemy territory. The CIA and KGB fought silent intelligence wars across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Both nations competed aggressively in science, technology, and space exploration. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 had shocked the United States profoundly. For the first time, many Americans feared the Soviet Union might surpass the United States technologically. That fear triggered enormous investments in science education, missile development, aerospace engineering, and military research. Washington understood that prestige mattered during the Cold War. Global influence depended partly on perception, and perception depended on confidence. The United States needed allies around the world to believe America was strong, stable, and capable of leading the free world. Patriotic symbolism contributed to that image. So did religious language. The Soviet Union officially embraced atheistic communism. America increasingly presented itself as a defender of freedom, faith, and individual liberty. The contrast became central to Cold War messaging. Then came October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days, the world moved closer to nuclear war than at any other moment in human history. American reconnaissance aircraft discovered Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba, only 90 miles on the Florida coast. President John F. Kennedy faced an impossible situation. If the missiles became operational, Soviet nuclear strike capability against the United States would increase dramatically, but military action carried enormous risks. Any attack on Cuba could trigger direct conflict between the two superpowers. Inside the White House, military leaders, intelligence officials, and political advisors debated possible responses under extreme pressure. Strategic bombers prepared for combat missions. Nuclear submarines moved into position. American forces entered DEFCON 2, the closest the United States has ever come to full nuclear war readiness. Across the country, fear spread rapidly. Families watched television broadcasts in silence. Schools reviewed emergency procedures. Churches filled with anxious Americans praying that war could still be avoided. And once again, the Cold War revealed how deeply patriotism, fear, and faith had become interconnected in American life. The pledge reflected that atmosphere perfectly. The words, "Under God," carried emotional weight during moments of uncertainty. Not necessarily because every citizen interpreted them identically, but because they symbolized reassurance during an age dominated by existential fear. The United States presented itself as morally grounded in a confrontation where survival of civilization itself seemed at stake. Eventually, the crisis eased. Negotiations between Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev prevented catastrophe. The missiles in Cuba were removed. Nuclear war was avoided. But the crisis permanently changed how Americans viewed the Cold War. The danger no longer felt distant. It felt immediate, real, fragile. And in the years that followed, patriotic rituals continued playing an important psychological role. The pledge remained central inside schools across the country. For many Americans, it symbolized continuity during an era of rapid global tension and domestic change. Yet America itself was also evolving. The civil rights movement challenged long-standing inequalities. Protests against segregation spread across the South. Television exposed violence and injustice to the nation. At the same time, younger generations increasingly questioned authority, government institutions, and Cold War assumptions. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War intensified those divisions dramatically. The conflict deeply polarized American society. Students protested on college campuses. Trust in political leadership weakened. Some Americans began questioning the very institutions and traditions earlier Cold War leaders had worked so hard to strengthen. Even the pledge itself occasionally became part of larger cultural debates. Court cases emerged surrounding compulsory recitation in schools. The Supreme Court ruled that students could not be forced to participate against their beliefs. That decision reflected one of the core contradictions inside Cold War America. The United States promoted unity against communism, but also defended individual liberty, even when disagreement created tension. That distinction separated the American system from Soviet authoritarianism, and despite political turmoil, the pledge endured, because by then, it represented far more than anti-communist messaging alone. It had become tied to memory, identity, childhood, national continuity. For millions of Americans, the words were inseparable from the broader experience of growing up during the Cold War, an era shaped by air raid sirens, televised missile crises, space launches, spy scandals, military parades, and the constant awareness that nuclear war could begin with almost no warning. Through all of it, the pledge remained one of the country's most consistent public rituals, repeated every day, generation after generation. A reminder that the Cold War was not fought only inside command centers, missile silos, or intelligence headquarters. It was fought in classrooms, churches, television broadcasts, political speeches, and in the symbols Americans used to define themselves against their greatest rival. Because the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union was ultimately about more than weapons. It was about competing visions of civilization itself. And few moments reflected that more clearly than the decision to transform a simple patriotic pledge into one of the most recognizable ideological statements of the Cold War era. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Cold War had entered a new phase. The United States and the Soviet Union still possess enormous nuclear arsenals capable of destroying humanity within hours. American ballistic missile submarines patrolled silently beneath the oceans. Strategic bombers remained on constant alert. Intercontinental missiles waited underground across the Great Plains. But the conflict had evolved beyond simple military confrontation. Now the struggle focused increasingly on endurance, economic power, technological innovation, political stability, and national confidence. The Soviet Union continued projecting military strength across the world, expanding influence through proxy conflicts and strategic alliances. Meanwhile, the United States relied not only on military superiority, but also on something far less measurable: national identity. American leaders understood that democracies depended heavily on public belief. Citizens needed confidence in their institutions, confidence in their system, confidence that the sacrifices demanded by the Cold War still served a larger purpose. That was one reason Cold War symbolism never disappeared. The pledge remained in schools. "In God we trust" remained on currency. Religious language remained deeply embedded in presidential speeches and public ceremonies. To many Americans, Those traditions reinforced continuity during uncertain decades. The Soviet Union promoted loyalty to the state. The United States promoted loyalty to ideals. That distinction mattered enormously during the ideological struggle between the two superpowers. And over time, the contrast became even more visible. By the late 1970s, the Soviet system showed increasing signs of strain. Economic stagnation spread across the Eastern Bloc. Innovation slowed. Political repression deepened public frustration. Meanwhile, the United States, despite internal divisions and political turbulence, continued producing technological breakthroughs, economic growth, and global cultural influence on a scale the Soviet Union struggled to match. American aerospace programs advanced rapidly. Computer technology accelerated. Satellite systems transformed military intelligence. The U.S. Navy projected power across the globe through massive carrier battle groups. And even during moments of crisis, the United States maintained one enormous strategic advantage. Its system allowed adaptation, debate, change. That flexibility became critical during the final decade of the Cold War. President Ronald Reagan entered office in 1981 with a dramatically different tone toward the Soviet Union. His administration increased military spending aggressively, modernized strategic forces, expanded missile defense research, and intensified ideological pressure against Soviet communism. Reagan also spoke openly about the moral dimensions of the Cold War. Once again, religious language became intertwined with anti-communist rhetoric. The Soviet Union was increasingly portrayed not merely as a geopolitical rival, but as a system fundamentally opposed to human freedom and spiritual liberty. By then, the Cold War symbolism created decades earlier had become deeply rooted in American political culture. The phrase, "under God," no longer sounded controversial to most Americans. It sounded familiar, normal, patriotic. Many people had completely forgotten the phrase, had only entered the pledge during the 1950s. That was perhaps the clearest sign of how successful the transformation had been. What began as a deliberate Cold War strategy eventually became part of national tradition itself. And then, almost unexpectedly, the Cold War began collapsing. The Soviet economy weakened severely during the 1980s. Political reforms introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev unintentionally accelerated instability inside the communist system. Eastern European satellite governments began losing control. Mass protests spread. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. And in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved completely. After nearly half a century, the greatest geopolitical confrontation in modern history was over. The United States emerged as the dominant global superpower. American military strength had played a major role in that outcome. So had economic power, technological innovation, strategic alliances, intelligence operations, and nuclear deterrence. But the Cold War had also been a battle of identity, a battle over belief, a battle over which system people trusted to shape the future of civilization. That was why symbolic decisions mattered so much. And that was why one short phrase added during the 1950s survived long after the Cold War itself ended. Even today, millions of Americans still recite the pledge with the words, "under God." Many carry currency bearing the phrase, "in God we trust." Often without realizing those expressions became national standards during one of the most dangerous periods in human history. A time when American leaders feared nuclear destruction. A time when communism appeared to be expanding globally. A time when Washington believed psychological strength and national unity were essential for survival. The decision to place religious language at the center of American public identity was not accidental. It was strategic, calculated, designed to create contrast between the United States and the Soviet Union during a struggle that extended far beyond military hardware. And regardless of political opinion, its historical impact is impossible to ignore because few Cold War decisions became so deeply woven into everyday American life. Children repeated the words in classrooms. Politicians spoke them publicly. Citizens carried them in their pockets, generation after generation, until they became part of the national landscape itself. The Cold War shaped weapon systems. intelligence agencies, military doctrines, and global alliances. But it also shaped language, symbols, and identity. The battle against communism was fought not only through submarines, bombers, and nuclear missiles, but through ideas powerful enough to define how Americans saw themselves during one of history's most dangerous eras. And decades later, the evidence of that struggle still remains visible every single day, not hidden inside classified archives, not buried in military bunkers, but printed openly on the nation's money and spoken aloud in classrooms across the United States. For more stories about the hidden decisions, secret strategies, and powerful symbols that shaped the Cold War, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and continue exploring Cold War discoveries.